I've never made somebody in a movie theater get up and move because I was crying so hard until...
In the Meg 2.
Yes, definitely the Meg 2.
Hi, I'm Stu Willis.
And I'm Mel Killingsworth.
And I'm Chaz Fisher.
And welcome to Draft Zero, a podcast where two emerging filmmakers and one emerging Australian try to break down what makes great screenplays work. And I managed to pull that off. Yeah.
Well done. Hopefully by the time this drops, I will knock on all the wood. It will be official.
And this episode, dear listener, is our long-awaited first episode on character arcs. Yay!
I have been working through some of the back catalogue because we have relaunched our website and we're kind of remastering some of the old classics. And it turns out we've been talking about doing a character arcs episode since 2014. But in classic Draft Zero fashion, it is shaping up to be at least 4 parts, maybe 5, maybe more.
Yeah.
Deep dive into character arcs. And I think the reason for this, and I'm just going to dive into it now before I let any of you speak, it's one of those really simple, you just need your characters to arc. And when you actually start asking the question of character arc, you actually realize it's a really deep, complex question. And I think the reason that people want to know about character arcs is that you go, oh, fuck, you're dealing with what I think it means to be human. I think I'm dealing with what is the purpose of art. Mm-hmm. And I think you're dealing then also with the craft level, like of how do I do this?
Yeah.
All right. Flash forward insights or zero context, maybe zero context insights. We can.
Yeah.
Zero context insights, everything can be mapped on 4-pointed chart.
Can you describe the chart to me so that I can visualize it? I have no fucking idea what you're talking about.
Essentially, it's this, right? So bad, good, change, no change, right? And so you can map them at different points.
That is an amazing axis. I did not understand.
Aha. Yeah, that's essentially your 2 axes. No change, change. Where on this spectrum do they fall? Good, bad. Where on this spectrum do they fall?
My insight is zero context insight. Is that I'm now beginning to think of character arcs as a emotional event between a character and themselves, between a character and those around them, and between a audience and the character. And I'm putting the audience first in that relationship. Yeah, that's it. But stay tuned for why.
Building on Stu, my big takeaway from the very meandering discussion we're about to have was that the choice whether to have characters arc or not and how they arc and what their transformation will be is ultimately what is the experience you want the audience to have in relation to your story. And I come to that realization way too late. But to summarize why you should listen to this episode, we determined the following questions through which to analyze character arcs in the future episodes. Do the audience enter stories with an expectation that there will be change? When or how does the film teach the audience to expect characters to change? Do the characters change? If they do change, was it an experiential or external change, or was it an internal value change? How is that dramatized? We come to a very useful rock metaphor in relation to that. How does the film want you to feel about that change? Is how the film wants you to feel about that change different to how the character feels about that change? And if so, how does the film pull that off? How does the story world punish or reward the transformation or the journey? What are the values explored by the transformation or the journey? How does this relate to the theme? How is contrast used as against affinity or unity through the character journey? Another potential spectrum or tool was phrasing of that was order, disorder, and inertia. What was the, and final question is related to Stu's big key learning, what was the emotional event created between the character and the audience as a result of the journey? Does the character end up more intimate or distant from the audience? When we first started this, we were doing like work on the screenplay gurus and also trying to figure out some tools about dramatizing, internal, like revealing character. And so that's why we've been talking about this for so long. But there was initially a question from me, like, do we even need character arcs? James Bond doesn't have an arc except in some of the Bond films.
Certainly none of the books.
And given it's optional, then, I would love to dig deeper into when to do it, when not to do it, how to do it, how not to do it. How do we, once we've even got through those paradigms of, do we want a character arc? Which characters do we want to arc?
And film and TV for me are two wildly different questions in all of those as well.
And then there's how do we measure it? Because I've got, this is a very personal thing that's not, I don't know if it might not work for everyone.
Are you being vulnerable, Chaz? Are you being vulnerable? Because you both feel safe and unsafe?
No, because I feel very safe. So I'm not being vulnerable at all.
I'm never vulnerable, says the Englishman.
To me, there's a big difference between characters learning something and fundamentally internally changing. I think any person goes through time, we change. Our cells literally change. We have different experiences. We get older. Change is inevitable. So I think when I'm looking for change, I'm looking for something more fundamental and internal. And then, Stu, you've been primed, but by your wife, and I can't wait to hear you mansplain Emma's teaching to you about the importance of story to humanity.
I hope she's waiting off screen to throw things at you if you wrongly phrase it.
I mean, big assumption that I didn't mansplain to her and then get her to repeat it back to me like she was an AI chatbot and make me go, yeah, I am really smart.
But also, I think a large part of character arcs is then intimately connected to what is this film about? What is the theme? What are the rules of the story world? Stu, you mentioned in our Discord chat that you think that there's an emotional event, as described by Judith Weston, between the audience and the characters.
Ooh, did I actually use that phrasing?
Yep.
Fucking hell. The Discord Stu is way smarter than fucking podcast Stu.
Can attest.
Wow.
So these are things that we're going to try and wrangle with in this primer episode so that we have a vocabulary, a taxonomy, and a lens to then tackle discrete types of stories. And at the moment, the ones that we have planned are a steadfast character arc, where the characters ostensibly do not internally change, and they may change the world around them, or it may be a survival film, or it may be a melodrama. We may get into subcategories in other episodes once we pick the homework. A positive arc, which feels like a more traditional Western storytelling, and then a negative arc, which in my head is definitely tragedy is one flavor of that, but where I guess characters change negatively. And then we'll get into a whole lot of what does negative mean? How does the story teach us that it's a negative or a positive change? Because Mel, what was the thing that you and I were arguing about, whether it was a tragedy or not?
No, it was. Oh, I do remember this. I remember having this argument.
It was Blue Moon.
Oh, it's Blue Moon, of course. Is Blue Moon a tragedy or not?
Oh, I listened to an interesting podcast about that.
Was it ours? Because you weren't
wasn't
on that
on
episode.
It, so yeah.
Yeah,
I listened to it while swimming.
That's could be dark depending on how you view that character arc. I think recently I've been figuring out how I visualize things, and I think this for me it's essentially 4 quadrants where you've got the quadrant graph, and you have characters either do change or they don't. They do change for the better or they do change for the worse. Characters changing for the better is a lot of heroes' journeys, etc. Character changing for the worse would obviously be something like the Godfather trilogy. And then you have characters who don't change for the better, like they were steadfast because they needed to be, and no matter what the world threw at them, they kind of remained stalwart or whatever. They may have learned something, but they don't necessarily fundamentally change. Some people, this is also interesting. Since I've done no homework whatsoever, off the top of my head, I'm thinking if you think about something like David Lowery's The Green Knight, some people might argue that it's that. And then you have characters that don't change for the worse. They need to change and they refuse to change, and that is bad.
The Green Knight is an amazing pull, by the way. That's one that we should try and break down.
Oh, it's and as soon as it came out of my mouth, I was like, "Oh, have you guys done that one on a podcast I wasn't on? I don't think you have. We should do that one."
No.
So, I mean, maybe that should be. So,
It's
If
great.
you haven't realized, there is no homework for this episode because basically we are recording our session 0 where we discuss the frameworks before diving into it. I think we found that really effective, particularly when we did ensembles, right? It helped us kind of come up with a lot of the terminology. And I think we even did the same thing with character motivations way back when. So I think, for example, what the two of you have articulated, and I'm going to take my interpretation of it because I agree with Mel, for the record.
You're just trying to get AI to fucking identify whenever Chaz is outnumbered from the transcripts.
The receipts. It is being told to be fair.
Oh, yes. We know how that works.
Told by Stu.
And told by whom? Yeah, exactly.
Having learned from hours of Stu listening to Stu.
Machines are all biased.
Related. So when you're talking about a character hasn't changed, and then they should have, you're talking about an audience perspective on that change. I think there is 2 layers to the character's arc, or 3 really, which is what happens to the character. Do they change or not change? For the better or worse. What is the character's experience of that or belief of that? Do they believe they've changed for better or for worse? Right? And then the third is, what is the audience perspective on that? So a character can change, right? That's the first kind of filter. Have they changed? Have they not? And then there's the judgment layer from the character, which is, do I believe this is for the better or for the worse? And then there's our perception of that. And the reason I bring that up is I think there is negative arcs, like, if I had legs, I can kick you, I will kick you. The Rose Byrne film, which is a negative character. Maybe it's one of the examples we decide to do because it is a downward spiral of the main character in which she is very aware she is downward spiraling. Sorry, Mel.
No, I've been meaning to see it and I haven't yet. So I just intentionally missed everything you said, which is fine.
Good. So maybe we should do it for the homework. Yeah. But it's an example of where the alignment between the character's perception of what's happening to them and the audience's perception of what happened to them is aligned. And so I think this comes back to character arcs are really difficult to talk about is because they're not just in isolation. Rarely is a film only about one character, right? So we're actually talking about how we harmonize other characters around them. Is one character steadfast and the other character positive? Like all that stuff is going to be the complexity I think we're going to dive into.
Yeah, and the complexity is so much. I think even calling it an arc is a misnomer, right? Because an arc, we think of that as shaped like a rainbow, and most of it is actually a character roller coaster. No matter whether they change or not, whether it's for the good or the worse, it's usually like there's corkscrews, there's loop-de-loops, there's backtracking. It's complex, especially in something like a TV show, right, where you just have all this time and space to explore that. So, like, calling it an arc is kind of simplistic.
All right. So, when I was thinking about how to structure this episode, I was like, let's start with what we think we want to learn. I think on the one hand, the 3 of us love dropping science and love talking about our own particular theories. The reason we do it in a podcast format is so we can argue about it and go, oh shit, yeah, Chaz was wrong. Computer says so. Or not, right? But like we like to challenge those theories. So there's another part of the reason that we do this and hopefully that other people is, for me, I want to learn stuff I hadn't thought about. I want to be like, oh fuck, I've never considered before in my life that Chaz could be right. So what do you want to learn?
So broadly, I do want to learn better because I think that I usually can conceptualize in my work the themes that I'm exploring. I can't be precise until I'm a bit further into the project, usually in pages, but broadly what I want to say with the piece. And I broadly usually have the plot that I want to put my characters through. And then I end up kind of retrofitting the characters to best suit that plot. And what inevitably happens is the first few drafts, the characters feel forced or faked or not real. And it takes more effort for me to align all those things in a harmony, as you say, Stu. So I think I'm looking to perhaps find a more character-driven process, assuming that most of the stories that I'm going to write will involve an arc. And I want our follow-up question to what do we want to learn to this to be like, do we need arcs? What are they? But Mel, what do you want to learn?
I think for me, so look, I have written a screenplay that I am now backwards adapting into a novel.
Like everyone in our writers group.
I've decided to write a novel this year. This year's the year of the novel. And I do think now analyzing the screenplay that I have written, right? And taking my chart that I have and plotting where each of the characters are on that chart by the end, right? And then saying, okay, because the chart allows you to have a little bit of they change. How much do they change? They change for the better mostly. They change for the worse. And then once you figure that out for each of the main characters, then figuring out what is the shape of the arc that gets them there. And I think for me that both the visualization and being able to do it for each character just along a simple, very simple rubric to start will allow me to, it's sort of when you're writing a scene for a character, when you're writing their dialogue, when you're writing whatever, just being able to glance at that one sort of North Star of where does that put is this a crazy thing for them to be saying, considering that by the end they actually haven't changed, or actually, we're a third of the way through and there's some significant change and it can't come all at once. What am I driving towards at the end? And just remembering that, just being able to sort of constantly look at that, I think that will be helpful. And yeah, also as we start to get into the nitty gritty, the steadfast and there's so many different types, and I'm sure we'll go over all of that vocabulary. I think that will be helpful. But in terms of at least, setting out the very basic definitions and stuff like that in this episode and just nailing down the arc that the character will have taken by the end of the story is very helpful. And again, to do it on a visual spectrum.
I have some ideas about that. Okay, so there's a couple of layers to this. One, I have strong opinions. Shock. Strong opinions that are loosely held. So I kind of want to get those out, right? So I do want to talk through what I think. It sounds arrogant, but really what I want to do is get them out of the way to create space for me to learn what I don't know, right? Which is like the things I haven't conceived about. And that's why you're here. And hopefully from the engagement from our listeners, please write in, give us feedback.
We are not settled on our homework. So Patreons, jump in and vote.
Or, if you're not we may or may not be setting up a voicemail thing where you can just send us 1 minute clips. I haven't decided yet. Anyway.
The power, the absolute power. Living space.
Yeah. At this point, I just read out Chaz's phone number. If you just want to send us voicemail.
Why is a food lawyer answering the phone?
The other thing, and it sounds flippant, but I'm someone who cries in pretty much everything, right? I cry in commercials. Like there are shows that really affect me, and I kind of have theories why these films and these shows affected me. And I do think it is related to character arcs, kind of. And I want more of that in my work. So my theory about myself and my work, which is slightly introspective, is that I'm actually someone I think who feels a lot. I react to film a lot. So particularly when I'm directing, I'm actually in some ways muting myself a little bit because I'm more susceptible to feeling emotion. So I think the work that I create isn't as emotional as the work that I like. Okay, that's it may not be an accurate read, but there's a reserved quality. And also, I am someone who somewhat has, for better or somehow, has learned to be quite emotionally regulated. So says my psychiatrist wife, anyway. Psychologist wife. She's not yet medical degree.
She does not read the Discord often enough.
Which Discord?
The Discord in which I'm really smart. That one. She just gets dumbstruck. So that's something I'm really interested in because there is this kind of like layer of what a character arc is. As I said right at the beginning, is the character arc is like a craft thing, and this is me beginning to unravel the way I think about it, which is just about keeping fucking people interested, right? We need arcs because otherwise shit becomes boring. So there's like a surface level, but then there's this other thing which is like the purpose of story, the profound reflections on self and life and the life journey and all that stuff that we may get to. And yeah, I want to be able to be bolder with my choices, both somehow more in control of my choices, but also less in control in a way, in that I don't want to be as measured with some of the stuff and, just be like, you know what, I'm going to go for it. That's kind of what I want to learn.
Do you mean emotionally? Like instead of like a balls out action sword fighting sequence?
Oh, I'm not. Okay. I mean, this is a survey episode. On the one hand, so we're talking about, we're doing this in 2026 for those that don't fucking check the dates of the podcast or somehow finding this in the future, right? And so we are, I do think, in a interesting point in time with the relationship with media and, the impact of AI and all those things. And I do think it's here. We can resist it, and I think we should think about the ways and we resist it, but all that stuff. I actually think the stuff that's going to become more valuable as both a consumer and a creator is stuff that's more emotionally authentic. The stuff that actually I think on a quote unquote business, not quote unquote, like the stuff that is going to be affected on a business level is spectacle. That's the stuff that's kind of becoming easier to reproduce. The stuff that I think is going to become more precious is the stuff that breaks your heart. One of my favorite records of all time is Jackson C. Frank. Folk singer, recorded one album, recorded it basically in like a day with Paul Simon. He died homeless in the 80s. And that's part of the narrative of it around it. But that album kills me whenever I hear it. It's just a guy on his guitar. And in somehow, to me, it's more profoundly emotional than a lot of really overproduced. I mean, there's a judgment term in that, in stuff that's got a lot more complexity. So yeah, there's a business decision in that as well. I get a business decision. Like, in what way are we still valuable? Well, hopefully, I know how to write sword action fighting scenes, and I spend time thinking about them, and maybe I'll be able to do them better than a computer, but a computer will never be able to imagine or conceive of loss or heartbreak or triumph. Right.
I do want to. I think we are going to have to talk a little bit about the point of story. And us being three people who are dedicating our lives to being storytellers. And I can hear the Smartless podcast hosts shuddering at that term. Whenever their guests call themselves storytellers, they get mocked mercilessly.
You get mocked mercilessly, Chaz, anyway. So.
But I think we need to talk about it, because otherwise it's like, do we need characters in, what are we trying to make? And I think the box that we're operating in for this series is we are talking about narrative, and we are talking about stories that have characters, right? So that when we are necessarily, unless we do an episode where we do go into media and experiences that either don't have characters, or maybe where you are the character, for example, as the audience member.
Oh, no second person.
No,
sorry.
I'm not.
No, I'm just saying for the purposes of this, it's its own thing.
Yeah, but my point is these other. I'm trying to draw the fence around what we're talking about.
The boundaries, yeah.
Because there is a point and purpose to why we as human beings are attracted to these, which then in turn goes towards that key fundamental decision: do my characters need to arc or not? Which I feel like is worth discussing in this primer episode, and we'll get into it more when we've got actual examples.
I think the fact that you are raising that as something that you actively think about is curious to me. Do you find that you start thinking about the question in a generative state? Like, I'm coming up with the idea, I need to work out how my character arcs, or is it something that you go, oh shit, people, I need to add this for whatever reason. People are losing interest, it isn't landing how you want.
I often know what are the plot events I want my characters to go through, and I don't really have a firm grip on what are the effects of those plot events on those characters. Do I want them to not be changed by it? Do I want them to be changed by it? So I think that's what I'm trying to get to.
You don't think you naturally think about that, and so you want this exercise to help make you think about that? Is that what you're saying?
I think I believe I think about it way too late in the development process. And to Stu's point, I think I come at it way too conceptually and intellectually, and not instinctively. Again, I'm constructing characters rather than perhaps inhabiting them. That comes later in the process.
Because you know that character needs to go through X plot, and so you're like,
Yeah,
well, it would
exactly.
help character to have X, Y
Trait,
characteristic.
right?
Sure.
And then I'm like, well, this character is too simple, so now I need a contradictory trait, and then but yeah, like I end up like fucking baking a cake by making 20 really shitty cakes. And I think this exercise will hopefully give me some like osmotic learning that I can absorb that will speed up that development process. I'm not sure if osmotic is a word.
It works. That conjugation works. Yeah.
I mean, it sounds correct.
If you've understood my intent, then it is a word.
If I were reading that written, I would breeze right with it. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. Look, I think you have shows, right? Something like The Bold Type, which is almost didactic in its we are here to teach young people how to grow up and be responsible humans and good friends and how to deal with partnerships and health, events and et cetera, et cetera. And then you have things that are, hey, we're going to explore a guy who makes meth in the middle of the desert. But all of those do, to some extent, teach us how to live, right? They teach us something about the human condition. They teach us something about ourselves. And the more aware of that we are, the more we can glean from that, both personally and as quote unquote storytellers. However, I will say, without going too much into it, I think very, very explicitly, and I can point to a couple of specific shows and movies and whatever, that when I was young, that film and television were my way out of a very bad situation. And it wasn't a conscious thing, but it was very much that through learning about these outside experiences, these experiences completely outside of my own even conception, as a child and a teenager, I was able then to finally manage to A, see that the situation I was in was sub-ideal, and B, see an alternative and see characters that I idealized or even aspects of them, if not specific, I want to be like them. Oh, but I want that stubbornness, or I want that, zest for the truth, or I want that fight, or I want that whatever specific aspect of this character to follow. And so, that's an arc, right? If you see a character arc, you see a character escape a bad situation and still survive, whether or not they're scarred by it, but be, come out on the other side glad they did what they did. And so, I unabashedly do think that that is important and something that I want to put in my work.
Like my day job as a lawyer, I do a lot of really detailed nonfiction based reading and writing.
Ugh.
And
though I'm assuming with AI and law, there's some fiction-based writing in that legal.
There's a lot of hallucinations.
I'm sure that's a case. Fucking go and look it up.
And I think, most document-based ways of actually affecting change require non-fiction writing. It requires policy documents. It requires persuasive speech. It requires fucking spreadsheets. It requires laws. It requires more documents, processes, blah, blah, blah. But I remember I'd read a few philosophy texts and found them fascinating. But it was when I read Sophie's World. I don't know if you guys have read it, but I'm going to spoil Sophie's World, but it's about a young girl who starts corresponding with an elderly gentleman, and each chapter he tells her about a philosopher. Because of the questions and learnings of that philosopher, she then sees her world differently. So it is actually like through a character and a narrative and their experience, I was able to actually grasp the experience of this philosophy in action. And it ends up that they end up realizing that they are in fact characters in a novel being written by someone else to teach their child about philosophy. And then they start trying to gain agency for themselves. Anyway, this is all just a long-winded way of saying that what I see now is that Sophie's World made philosophy, non-fiction, actionable for me through a character experiencing those philosophers. Without a character and without a narrative, I would have found it harder to implement action or change myself, even though I might have been reading the same philosophical texts.
That is a lot of young adult fiction deals with that transitional stage between having no agency to gaining independence, right? And you are dealing with children who are going through that push-pull of my parents are awesome, my parents suck, I want them to take care of me, I'm independent, right? And they're going through it in different ways because they're different individuals. But I think maybe that's something that we're also tapping into arcs, is that, as you talked about, change is something we all go through. So change management is actually part of what stories deal about dealing with. What is it like? I've had long hair for most of my life, and I've recently, and I'm in my mid-40s, and I'm now looking at my hairline going, oh fuck, I'm actually beginning to lose hair. Like, I was slightly receding, now it's just like fucking accelerated. And it is horrifying to me. And I've had other friends who were like, yeah, welcome to my 20s, buddy. Like, you had a good 3 decades, motherfucker. So it's like, that is part of what we're talking about, right? And this is why we're doing this all in the primer, because I think when we actually pick our examples, we might be able to be like, oh, this is interesting. They're focusing, this is what the character's experience of change is. Maybe there is a value or a belief around change. So if a character changes, it's not only do they think that he's, you know, part of their self-reflection on change is how they feel about change. If we're dealing with this idea that transformation is a fundamental part of the life experience, which it is. I don't actually think you can argue anything. Everything dies. That is but everything is reborn. I mean, you know, this is the Philip Pullman thing. Every part of you is going to live forever. Oh, well, more accurately, every part of you is going to exist until the end of time and space. Right. And maybe that's the heat death of the universe or the great collapse, or maybe it's infinitesimal. But the fact is, on the scale of it, it's just what do you become? And you were talking about like Western traditions, and I'm not going to butcher the word because Kim will kill us, and they're the one that brought it up. But it is the idea of change in kind of Eastern art is one of the fundamental ideas of what they're dealing with. The transformation is what they're interested in from a storytelling point of view.
I mean, fuck Neil Gaiman for becoming the very thing that all his work criticized. Being my favorite author, it's really brutal to come up against the reality. But one of the amazing observations that he had is one of the Endless Dream's younger brother, the anthropomorphication of change and transformation was called destruction, because you can't create something new without destroying something old. I guess fundamentally, like, I'm coming at this from, if we define change really broadly, it's going to, everyone's going to arc every second of every movie. And I think of change perhaps too narrowly, but I go, is there a fundamental change in ethical or moral or worldview of a character? Because I do think I've seen it in other people. I mean, Stu, you've said you've become a well-regulated human being. You have changed.
What makes you think I become and wasn't always better at emotional regulation?
I feel that was your verb construction.
Rewind the tape. We have the technology. Chaz is going to drop the film clip from 10 minutes ago back into the edit timeline.
You know, I am someone who somewhat has, for better or somehow, has learned to be quite emotionally regulated.
But I think to your point, Mel, we do it, like, going back to our yelling match about shrinking. Stories are a safe way for us to have experiences other than our own. And the main way that we as humans, I think, can access that is by seeing characters.
And you're asking if it's a yes, this character has changed, no, they haven't. What's the tipping point or what's the toggle that takes it from a yes to a no? How do we sort of find that? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. Or what's the effect of doing it or not doing it so that it is a more conscious choice?
What is the effect? That's a big question.
Early James Bond films, James Bond does not change. He has lots of experiences. He does not change.
But yeah, I mean, we'll get into this now steadfast, but the world changes around him in response to him. That's how.
Does it? There are more dead people.
Yeah,
but
he's alive.
One
to death
less
seems
supervillain.
That seems like a big change, right?
I would say Dalton is the first time you actually see change.
I'm going to start doing my, info dumping about the ways I think about things because I do think it is relevant here to what you're talking about in terms of what do we understand as change, right? When is it too little or when is it too much?
Yeah.
So there's a bit of a backstory here. I'm sorry. When I came out, it's actually an important backstory and we can cut it. But my undergraduate, I did a combined degree with media and law. My main kind of interest coming out of high school into university were kind of like what I think you could broadly call English literature, or like literature and music, right? And I think film ended up appealing for me because it combined like literature with the kind of time, like music, right? Music is about rhythm and construction and timing and all those things. And film has it. I mean, Kubrick always spoke to me because he talks about film being more like music than painting, for example, because it's a succession of moods. But when I graduated, I kind of like early 20s, I was like, I need to work on my eye. Like I have some instincts about what works, but I want to get better at it because I think most of the time we think of film as a literary medium, not as an audiovisual one, right? I mean, we're doing a podcast on screenwriting, not a podcast on shots. And there's a reason for that. And that's why Shot Zero exists because shots don't really, talking about shots as a visual thing or editing doesn't really work in podcast form, right? So there was this book I discovered called The Visual Story, which is by a guy called Bruce Block. I've read it. I ended up, when I taught like motion design, used it as like almost my textbook. I threw out their textbooks and went like, I'm going to use this as my guide. Visual Story applied a whole bunch of art theory, which I hadn't learned because I came into film from the literary world, not from the art world. And I think that is, in my experience of film, is actually kind of the two convergence points. A lot of DPs come out of art schools. A lot of wannabe directors and writers and maybe editors come out of like effectively the literary school of film. The core idea in it is the two principles which he calls contrast and affinity. So he basically breaks down how they're the fundamental design principles of everything. Rhythm is constructed from on-off. That's contrast. You don't have rhythm unless you have contrast. But the repetition of turning that into on-off, on-off, on-off is actually the affinity that the rhythm gets its construction from the way it balances contrast and affinity together creates the rhythm. But it goes into a whole bunch of stuff. Coming into character, and one of the things then he goes into is tone and the way in which we understand tonality and the way we map tone is how it is relative to everything else. Our eyes literally adjust the way they tone map our environment based on the environmental cues, right? Which kind of, this is a whole other conversation, but the whole movies are getting too dark is like, yeah, because they don't give you a fucking bright highlight, right? For you to understand I only understand that is really dark because you give me something super bright in the frame is like classic cinematography. And now we're like, oh, let's just dim it all down to consistent. You need the contrast for us to understand. You need contrast to understand silhouettes. So I think one of the things I'm coming into with arcs is how are you creating contrast? Not just the contrast over time or forward from the character that they go from they're hateful, now they're loving, which is, we'll go into the specifics of that, but how we even understand that as a thing? How do we understand that this character's values exist is about contrast? That we, in that point of time, understanding that this person has underdog values, to use the Michael Arndt term, because he's talking about character arcs when he's talking about the philosophical stakes or the values. Oh, this is underdog values. To understand that's an underdog value, you have to have contrast around it.
And also, you kind of have to establish the world that they're in, right? Because in something like Predator Badlands, by the time you get to the end of his arc, that you understand it's an arc because you understand the world as well as you understand the contract, like how he started. But if you were to drop him into a different movie or into our world, you would not say that that is good or that he has changed or whatever, because you're creating a contrast between him and his specific world as opposed to just, good, bad.
I mean, that is an excellent point, Mel, that this is where one of the ways that I think character arcs ties into film, because character arcs, whether you have them or not, can reveal the value system of the characters, and whether that's punished or rewarded, can reveal the value system of the world that they're in, and by extension, what it is that you as the filmmaker is trying to say one way or another. And I love the contrast and affinity concepts here. I'm writing down as we go a list of questions that I think we should ask of every film as we go through the series.
So I take contrast and affinity, and when I think about it, particularly over time, right, because we're dealing with time-based art, and that's what an arc is. Maybe in the visual arts world, you look at a Rothko, and I love fucking Rothko, but I don't go, I'm experiencing arc in Rothko. Maybe there is some transformative qualities while I scan through the image, and I'm kind of doing that mental thing, but he's not, you've got a control of it in composition. There is like the eye scan in a good composition, but I do think it works differently. I think about it as unity, right? And I think affinity is a good word as well. But unity, contrast I still think works. But you're talking about the transformation. That's what time gives you.
Yeah.
Time gives you the movement from order to disorder. It gives you movement from A to B or A, B, C, right? Black, white. And that to me is where you're on. It is the movement that releases emotion. That's part of my theory. It is seeing the character go from A to B.
Yeah.
That is actually the releasing of the emotion, not the B, whatever B is. I know it sounds like I'm being analytical, but I'm
no, but it's all still relative, right? Like if you have a show like Better Call Saul, which if you're including something like Breaking Bad, spans 20 odd years, right? That character changes significantly. However, there's this great French movie called Full Time that happens essentially almost in real time, right? It essentially happens over the course of like a day. And that character also drastically changes over the course of a day. But where she drastically changes is you're saying drastic because of the span of time that happens. And if she made that exact same change over 20 years, that if her character, like the shift in her worldview that happens over that day, if that shift happened over the course of 20 years, you would say that character had not changed.
So it has to happen at enough speed.
I think so. You look at a rock that's been sitting there for 1,000 years and you're like, yeah, actually the stalactite dropping a bit of water onto it has changed this rock. But has the rock changed? No. Right. Like it's a bit relative. You'd say has it changed in the span of since the rock began? Yeah. Has it changed in my lifetime? No. So that does have to you have to contextualize it a bit.
Weirdly, the rock is a really good abstraction for this.
Thank you.
Because it is about, is it changed because of external forces or is it changed internally? Right. But the rock doesn't change as an innate's dangerous word, but the rock doesn't change because of quality of it being a rock, really.
Right. It's still a rock.
It's the externals versus acting it, right? Whereas like rock that is molting is changing because of what it is. So there are probably characters that are rocks in which they're only changed by external factors, and they're characters that are probably whatever the opposite is.
Lava.
Fire.
Rocks is an excellent example, like a chemical reaction. Like
Mm-hmm.
Coal turning into diamond, for example.
Yeah, and the whole thing that makes rocks not alive is that they don't change. Life is a constant stimulation and a reaction, right? So we're talking about, is it a stable reaction or is it an unstable reaction, or is it completely yeah. Like, I mean, it sounds weird, but coming back to your life thing, Chaz, my bigger abstraction of that, because I like abstracting things to the point of uselessness, is that I think it's not just about learning to live. I think it's about culture, because I think there are kind of two camps. And look, there's a big spectrum in between. There are people that are like, I tell stories to literally document my personal experience, but I don't expect it to have an impact on the world. And there are other people, the other extreme is, I'm not documenting my personal experience at all, but I believe I can have an impact in the world, right? Like, are you inward or outward looking? And I think this is more than just a binary, but I think so to me, culture is the way of capturing that as an idea. Right, because culture captures values, it's lessons, it's a whole bunch of stuff. But how else do we communicate culture? How else do we even think about culture other than as separate to instinct? God, that's getting.
I know we're getting abstract, but in a weird kind of way, I always knew we would have to get somewhat abstract because we have to deal with the fundamental idea of should characters arc or not.
That's actually taps into a deeper question of should characters arc is like, can people change? Is a world
exactly.
view.
Yeah, absolutely. And on top of that is not only, if we're ever going to talk about internal change, we're going to have to find some kind of values-based way of discussing that, because without sounding moralistic or didactic, because even positive or negative, those characters may feel the film may be telling us this was a negative change or a negative arc for this character, but the character may be, fuck yeah.
So the question is, how does because this is the thing, and it does tap into what else you were kind of using the language around punishment and reward, because I think there is the in between, which is that you have, has the character change? Mm-hmm. Yes or no? How do they feel about that change? How does the world in the story feel about that change? Right? That's what punishing and rewarding is talking about. And then there is how we feel about it. And those are three separate things. A character can think that they have changed for the worst. The world can be like, no, actually, you are fucking awesome. And then and the way the filmmakers position us as an audience is to feel bad for it.
Yeah.
I think the difficulty is as the more as you as a filmmaker or as a creator are pulling, for lack of a better word, pulling the camera away, the less control you have over it. Which is that I think you can have a character clearly go, I feel fucking awesome that I murdered all those people. And you can have other characters go, I agree, James Bond, you are awesome because you killed all those hooges. The third part of how does the audience feel about it, you've got some control, but clearly conversations around Starship Troopers,
Wolf of Wall Street,
and many other films show that just because you work really hard to say Homelander is a bad guy, people will be like, but I identified with him and he would never suck dick to save his life. He would murder a whole bunch of people, but he draws the line at sucking dick, like Matt Walsh.
I think that was Gorilla Dick specifically.
Like I do come back to, we glanced on this and we didn't have the tools to discuss it, and maybe we'll use it as an example. But when we came to Blue Moon, I think there was you put your finger on it, Stu. I thought of it as a tragedy because I was putting my own moral value judgments on this beautiful creative soul.
Mm-hmm.
Like taking active choices that were going to prevent him from expressing his art and ultimately dying. And Mel, I think you were pointing out, but this is what made him happy.
She did.
Yes, he was making that active choice.
Right.
But he wouldn't have made the other choice. That wouldn't have made him him. That would have been compromise.
You said it was a sad ending, and I said, I don't think he looked at it that way.
Yeah. And so I think it'll be interesting to see if we can point to objective lessons about whether the film was directing us to feel one way or another, or whether it was genuinely leaving it in our laps, and what is the impact of that?
Okay, so the other tool, which I'll say in the kind of more emotional way, which is many years ago I worked with he was the stereoscopic supervisor when we worked on Happy Feet too. He talked about scenes basically just being goodbyes. He was like, a sad scene is just all sad scenes are goodbyes, and all happy scenes are kind of like hellos. And I think he's really talking about gain and loss. And like that is a very clear contrast. And I think when we start mapping of these, you'll see that they've set up what the beginning position looks like. And that means, like, I guess if it's cycles, you go from gain, loss, gain, or loss, gain, loss. And it sounds analytical.
Mm-hmm.
But, I mean, maybe this is most of my middle age. Like, it's just the inexorable slide towards grief.
Mm-hmm.
But so in fact, I mean, that sounds sad, but it actually means that anything that is joyous, that is about gain, about connection, are all the stuff that works for me, right? Anything that speaks to community, I know works for me, but community is often about connection, which is gain, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like the feeling of separation or breaking apart, which is loss. But I think you can actually think about that in terms of characters, and this connects to the values. Walter White, I think at the very end, thinks he's winning because he's gaining what he values.
I would argue, yes, he's gaining what he values, but he didn't think he valued that at the beginning of his journey. What he values has also changed, not just whether he's gaining it. And that's again where you get into something like TV, which I think has a lot more room to explain that. Like in a film, but I actually think that his fundamental shift, not just of what he values, but what he thinks he values, which are two different things, both have shifted by the end dramatically.
I got mocked mercilessly in my last year of high school because all my stories started with in my house in France.
Nothing has changed, Chaz. Nothing has changed.
But I was 16, living in Argentina, having the time of my life. I was in boarding school and I fucking loved being away from my family, and we were going out clubbing and drinking every weekend. It was just so awesome. And then my parents one day said, we're fucking moving to Australia. And that was in between my penultimate year of school and my last year of school. And I was already planning like the year 12, the end of school trip, the prom equivalent. I was going to be in leadership positions within the school. Like, my whole life was upended. And I still feel the pain of my parents. Like, I still hold a grudge against my parents for doing that to me.
Mm-hmm.
And even my phrasing around it. They I don't know if they gave a shit about what was happening to me. They were like, we've got to do this for external reasons. But my mum constantly defends herself by pointing out, and it's annoying that she's right, that within 2 months of moving to Australia, I met the love of my life with whom I now am married and have children. And that would not have happened. And so I'm trying to simultaneously hold in my
grudge.
Like, can I let go of that grudge given what I've gained? Like your talk about loss and gain in there. But also at the same time, I think it's okay to feel and acknowledge loss while also...
Because life is complex.
It's the roller coaster and the loop-de-loops and the backtracking. It's not a smooth, rainbow ride.
We gain Mel as a citizen, and America gains not having her.
And America keeps taxing her.
Yeah, that's it. Everybody wins but me.
and the world, which is us, is happy about that. So how does the audience feel? I'm conscious that my mum listens to this occasionally. I'm just like that slightly 20-year-old who thinks I still am, but who thinks they're really smart. Oh, dude, it's like the second law of thermodynamics. Like, we're talking about creation and destruction. We're talking about contrasts. In some ways, creation is the bringing of something together. Isn't that what and destruction is the taking it apart. But then we're like, oh, there can be creative destruction in which the destruction makes something new. And then there's inertness, which is the absence of either of those things. Right. That is coming back to the heat death of the universe. That is, to me, what is so horrifying about that idea, which is that it just stops.
Yeah.
To me, that is actually fundamentally on a cosmic horror level more horrifying than, the whole universe, the Big Bang is going to become to the big collapse. It's like, well, that implies that it's going to keep going. And so to me, arcs, it's that question of like, are you changing or are you not changing? I think is actually a really, and then the question is, are you actively resisting that change? Coming back to Mel thing, or are you enabling that change? I think that is kind of like an interesting question, like when I'm beginning to recede, am I like, fuck yeah, I'm just going to shave my hair. I'm going to go from like shoulder length hair for like a long time, 15 years at this point, and then just shave it all off? Or am I just going to resist the change?
Or do you try to cut it and then grow it back out and then try to comb it over or then try to wear it up and then like always wear maybe there's other stages,
And there is, and there's some of them are very contextual. There are absolutely guys who can pull off they got the tiny little ponytail and they're mostly bald and they look cool as fuck in a way, well, from my perspective, that if they were like, I'm just shaving my hair off and growing out the beard, they wouldn't be. I don't know.
And how does the world reward or punish you for these choices?
Exactly.
And how do you feel about those choices? And how does the audience seeing a story about you going through this transformation feel?
And who does it matter? Who matters the most, whether it's you or whether it's us or whether it's Emma?
So as much as I talked about the camera pulling back, I think what is so fascinating about this is characters aren't real. The worlds aren't real, but our experience of that is. So you've got this tension between what I'm saying, that the writer has control, particularly in some ways the most around the character, but whatever. We can get into the philosophical mucky muck about that. But essentially, the audience is always, well, I mean, if you're lucky, you've got an audience for your work, right? Maybe it's just you, but hopefully it's not just you as the writer. It's at least one other person, your long-suffering wife or friends who read your stuff or more. And then you've got the other layer, which is the text, and then the layers within the text. And that's important because I do think that's the tension we're trying to balance, and you're always trying to balance, which is I want to be true to the characters, but we have since the beginning been very conscious of what the audience's experience of the material is, and I think thinking about the ways they even understand what the character arc is, to start, how does the audience even meant to comprehend how this character changes is a huge question.
Yeah.
That I think most of us, you're going to look at it and go, well, it's from here, but it may help you diagnose. I now look back at projects that we may be actively working on and going, how is the audience meant to understand how this character changes? How will we, that's the dramatization question, right?
Yeah. Can I read out the running list of questions that I've written down from this discussion that we could apply? And look, this is, I think, when we've done this in the past, where we've had the list of questions, we've totally forgotten about them and then just talked about each example. So this is more, I guess, of an opportunity, I guess, to have an analytical lens. All right. You said something really early on, Stu, that stuck with me, and I think it's an important question. When or how did the film, and I'm using film shorthand for film and television, teach us as the audience to expect whether characters will change or not? Because I think that is, you mentioned it in passing, but I think it's so important. I think the story will set us up in a way to expect characters to change or not, and then either subvert that expectation or not. But I think it's an important tool for us to look at these stories that we're going to be diving into and go, how have they set us up to, what are the expectations that the story is setting up for us in the beginning? Did the characters change? Was it experiential change or internal value change? How is that dramatized? Is the character aware that they changed? How do they feel about that change? Does that even matter?
Mad who?
Yeah. How does the film want to make you feel about that change? If different to the character, how has the film done that? How does the story world punish or reward the transformation? What are the values explored by the arc? How does this relate to the theme? How is contrast versus affinity or unity portrayed through the character's transformation? What is the emotional event created between the character and the audience as a result of this transformation? And maybe I should say journey rather than transformation, because that's assuming there is a transformation.
Can I set up one question that I think would
please.
have to come before all of those other questions because it's a little bit more meta?
Excellent.
And that is, do we broadly, does the general public enter stories with, whether it's a conscious or subconscious expectation, do we come to a story with an expectation that there will be change, whether for better or worse? Whether that's a cultural thing or whether that is, some cultures may, some might not, or whether it's because we're storytellers, we might more than others. But is that an expectation of us entering into a film, a TV show, etc.? I know what I personally do, but yeah.
Look, I think it's individually specific. And this is on my mind for obvious reasons, which is I've been thinking about the very positive reaction to A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, right? And people saying, oh, it's this unwoke show. It's amazing. It's just back to the old days of heroic art and all this stuff.
How is it unwoke? Anyway, sorry.
I think the answer is, my interpretation of it when you kind of read into what they're saying is there's a couple of things. One, this is a character who's rewarded for resilience. And I think it is Lindsay Duran has talked about particularly resilient characters. Really, audiences love characters that are resilient and then are rewarded for it, right? Like which is kind of the steadfast arc. So this is a character who's like, we define him as, we think of the spoilers. He's this guy that thinks who doubts. So it's important that he doubts that he's a knight. And in the trial, the trial of the seven, and hopefully by the time this podcast is out, I finally finish what is going to be in a very long video.
Not a chance. Surely not a chance.
Which is going to happen. That this episode will come out of the video account.
This episode will this is me based on the experience of your previous videos having to go through like 18 iterations shared with the Discord, and we have yet to see one edit.
Someone put money on it.
I'm taking the under.
I'm going to say my video will come out because I'm not editing this podcast. Because until the video comes out. So
annoyingly, you are also currently in charge of the release of podcasts. So you could game this system and just hold this episode hostage until your Night of the Seven Kingdoms video is released.
Yes.
Anyway, sorry, I interrupted. Night of the Seven Kingdoms. Resilience.
Night of the Seven Kingdoms, resilient. So he's got clear, quote-unquote, underdog. This is the Michael Larn stuff. He's got underdog values. He is resilient. And then he is triumphant. And I think that is the positive stories that, like, all audiences want positive stories, is kind of connected to that. And I think the reason it is unwoke, this is so my politics, is that it is a simplified view of the universe. The richness of game. I love Night of the Seven Kingdoms. I love the tone. But the big contrast between it and Game of Thrones is Game of Thrones is a lot more like nuanced in, what even is a character journey? It's got many of them stacked on top of each other, but that whole character's resilience, overcome a great obstacle, and then is, importantly, rewarded. And this raises to me the other question is, what do we even mean by story world? At what point do secondary characters or just other, like even that implies a hierarchy. How do we know what the primary character is? What makes something a secondary character? What makes Luke the primary character, not Han? Han is the one that changes. Luke may or may not be. Leia, she is just as steadfast as Luke, perhaps even more fucking resilient. They torture Leia and she does not give it up, right? Like, she is a fucking champion in that film, but it is Luke that is rewarded.
What rewards do you give a princess?
Who is the leader of the rebellion?
They stop torturing her and she regains her freedom?
Yeah, I mean, they didn't give them, but this shows the point, right?
Yeah.
Like, at what point do we map on the reward as in Luke as the primary character because he is the one that is rewarded? If they put a medal on Leia, right, in the medal summary, do we go like, I mean, she's on screen before Luke.
Chewbacca's fucking robbed.
Chewbacca is absolutely robbed, but I mean, Star Wars is very speciesist. I mean, droids are absolutely tromped on. Anyway, speaking of Star Wars and droids and presumably sex, Mel, you want to say
That's
something?
my segue. Actually, I didn't. Anything in particular? No, I have lots of Star Wars thoughts about, well, sex. Look, I think the medal ceremony is super fascinating when you consider the way that Andor and Rogue One lead right up to it, and you're just imagining who is like just off screen, right, watching that medal ceremony happen and being like, why does he get a medal and nobody knows my name? It's actually really fucking fascinating to think of from that viewpoint, in terms of who's changed and who's rewarded. Very different things.
Sorry, this is a non sequitur. The distinction that I have internally, like conceptually, between the rock being changed through external forces and whether it undergoes like internal intrinsic change, I do like that abstraction. I think it works. It's a really good metaphor. Is it a metaphor? Mel called me up on that in the shrinking episode. But one of the tools that I use at the beginning of any kind of project is there's this graph that Michael Hay, one of the fucking gurus, has mapped out where it's is 6-stage plot structure, but on the bottom is the outer journey where you've got setup, opportunity, new situation, change of plans, progress, point of no return, complications and high stakes, major setback, final push, climax, aftermath. And all those plot beats, to my mind, are all the external things that happen to the character, right? And those are what most gurus, I feel, tend to focus on. And what I find super helpful, not necessarily his labeling of them, but he's mapped the inner journey of a single protagonist against those very same beats.
Oh God, I recognize this diagram.
So during the setup, the character is living fully within identity. During the new situation after the opportunity, the character is glimpsing, longing of destiny. After the change of plans, they're moving towards essence without leaving identity. So these are very sort of Freud and Jungian terms, but I find that super helpful for me because it's forcing me at this very conceptual stage of just writing out major plot points of my story to think about what are the characters undergoing at this same time. And sometimes I've thrown them out after doing that mapping.
So what I find is interesting about this is that you're like, well, we have a plot already, right? In some ways, that is an arc of its own, whatever it is, but it's literally taking the audience on it. And then you're kind of reverse engineering the character's experience of the plot in a way to think about what their arc is as a result of the plot rather than how it's there, what your intention is for their arc and how that will create the plot. Is that kind of like
Yeah. I mean, it does happen. Like I go through this, I ask these questions very early on of an internal perspective as well, but I'm forcing myself to do it and I'm conceptually building it. But perhaps it's a reflection of how I experience the world. I feel predominantly at the expense of external events rather than in charge of them.
But which stage are you? Are you fully committed to essence but growing in fear? I mean, age-wise, you probably should be.
Yeah.
But
Shots fired.
Have I passed the point of no return? Yes, I have.
As someone who's just crossed into living one's truth with everything to lose.
I'm not sure that the labels help, but just forcing me to map the inner journey of a character against the plot, that I'm more usually I have a clearer idea of the plot beats of a story before I've got an understanding of the character's experience of those.
So this does connect to the observation, which is part of the reason you have a quote unquote low point at the third act, end of the third act, that you have the low point or the Dark Night of the Soul, whatever you want to call it, at the end of the third act is actually so the triumph that happens feels bigger. There's just literally more contrast. So you can kind of, once you become aware of this, if you've got a story in which the break from the second act into the third is the character kind of head, right? You'll go, well, the climax of this film is going to be them losing, right? Because it's the roller coaster. The roller coaster peak works only because it's going to go as low as it can go. And the reason you want to go low is so you can rack people high. A roller coaster is the movement between the peaks and the troughs. A roller coaster that's just on a flat road is just driving in Melbourne. It's kind of this interesting thing of the audience experience of it, how that relates to the character.
Yeah.
And the contrast.
Is that not reflect? And again, this is my personal worldview, but change for humans, I guess I say humans more broadly, change for me is easier to adopt when there has been, I won't say trauma necessarily, but a significant experience.
Sounds like trauma, Chaz.
Sure, it can be falling in love. It can be anything, but it's significant.
We are pattern recognizing machines. Like that's how we've evolved to survive, right? And usually we want to adhere to the pattern, and to adopt a new pattern, usually something quite disruptive has had to occur to make us embrace it and to make that change stick. I mean, I do love the observation that a whole lot of, happily ever afters would have ended in divorce a year later. And that's quite a reasonable observation, that most rom-coms, certainly some of the classic or more cliched ones, these people barely know each other. I fucking love how Frozen subverts that, like it really is leaning into the love at first sight. And then it goes, he's a fucking sociopath who's trying to murder you.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, and maybe that low point is reflective of an experiential thing where it is easier to change fundamentally following a low point or a significant peak or trough.
Ooh,
Do you guys have any other questions to add to my list that we'll take into our...
I think that's a really good set of questions. What I do maybe have is a list of about 20 films, and also I've discovered exactly how I want to tie this back into my very first ever episode and bring the whole thing full circle. And also, you better believe I'm going to talk about Cassian Andor changing.
Excellent. Okay, so...
Fun.
I've not only thoroughly enjoyed myself, I'm not sure how much value listeners will get from this episode, other than perhaps it's prompting them to ask the same questions of their own work and what they're going to, and hopefully weigh in on the Patreon polls for homework suggestions.
So I would say, once we've settled on the homework, and look, are we going to start with steadfast or are we going to start with positive? Like, what is your gut instinct?
Why don't we start with negative? Why don't we start with doesn't change?
Well, that's steadfast, not negative.
Well, steadfast, but right, could be for the worse.
Well, I think steadfast, our instinctive reaction has been steadfast is actually where to start, because a lot of what people think of hero's journey stories require the character to not change.
Well, it's the story circle as well. They return to the same place having changed and then do it again.
Yeah.
Well, I disagree. Like, I like the story circle. I think it's really good. And I think the fact that it's actually not overly detailed is what makes it work. But I think the difference with the hero's journey and the story circle is when you break down the hero's journey, the important thing is that they learn what they need to learn, which is mostly physical, in order to return with the elixir and change the village. The important part of me in my reading of the hero's journey and the writer's journey, because they're slightly different, is it is about their impact on their home village that is the change, rather than the ways in which they're changed necessarily.
Oh, we've got to do Xena.
I mean, my classic example is Harry Potter, right? Like, Harry Potter wins at fucking Harry Potter by never changing, despite going from a kid being tortured by his adopted uncle and aunt in a fucking cupboard in
Some shire.
yeah, to having his mind explode, like going through the most ridiculous experiential journeys.
Mm-hmm.
And he does have some internal moments. They're usually actually the worst parts of the books to read, is J.K. Rowling failing to like capture what it's like to be a teenage boy wrestling with internal conundrums.
Oh.
But he wins by not changing, right? Like internally. He wins
Yeah.
by being
Yeah.
the same little boy that he was before he knew magic was real.
It's the only way he could win.
And that is a story, plot, and world that rewards his lack of transformation, of him being steadfast.
So this comes to his steadfast. It's his resilience. So we talk
Yeah.
about a steadfast arc. Resilient arc might
Yeah.
be a more heroic. I like the neutral language of steadfast because I think we might find films, if we can find an example of a character that is steadfast and they're punished
Mhm.
Yeah.
rather than rewarded.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what melodrama is, right? Like,
But then you also have whether they're punished or not is whether does not necessarily relate to if it's for better or worse for them personally, because so it's almost, you're
Yeah.
breaking this down into,
look, if nothing else, I'm glad that we've had this discussion so that we've got the questions to approach these films with.
So even less people decide to tune in for the next episode.
fewer.
Talking about a downward spiral that is then punished negatively. How do you feel about it? I feel negative about it. Mel was reminding me that, that downward spiral is bad. How do you feel about it?
So I think Stu and Mai's instinct to tackle resilient or steadfast first is because it reflects what a lot of Western storytelling paradigms, and we can highlight the fact that the characters are not actually changing, and it's a useful kind of starting point.
Yeah, and it might be an interesting. So when I was looking through these movies that killed me, like there's also films like A Million Miles Away, which I didn't think was a great film. Like it's a good, it's like a 7 out of 10. But I was bawling my eyes out at the end of that film, because that is an example of a resilient film. And in some ways, it's like that is that interesting space. Coming back to a catharsis episode, it's the watching Field of Dreams and going, I'm not a huge fan of this, but why are you so successfully manipulating me? And that's really interesting, because if I'm going to be a mid screenwriter, and I'm lucky if I'm that, but if I'm mid, how can I be mid and make you cry?
Write about baseball. Write about baseball.
Yep.
I can help you.
Yep.
Write about baseball. Like it is a shortcut.
You're not wrong.
It is.
We need to find the cricket version of a baseball movie.
I don't think there is.
It's
because
called
baseball's
Lagan.
too.
It's Lagan. Why are we not doing a Bollywood film, Chaz? And you like Eastern story, Eastern telling.
I mean, this is a good metric for how do we pick homework, is how much that it makes you cry.
Pride and Prejudice, Meg 2, The Trench, and
and All of Us Strangers. That is quite a movie marathon day.
Yeah.
Pride and Prejudice and All of Us Strangers are probably closer.
I've never made somebody in a movie theater get up and move because I was crying so hard until...
In the Meg 2.
Yes, definitely the Meg 2.
Just to mount a potential argument here, I feel that All of Us Strangers has to sit in positive, because the journey that Andrew Scott's character has to go through is a positive one, because at the end he has to have space for the Paul Mescal character. And he wouldn't, at the beginning of that film, had the space for the Paul Mescal character.
Okay. So I think that's actually my hand grenade / useful tool from that observation. It's a good one. And it kind of threads the needle between how characters feel about it and the world.
And how the audience fucking feels about it. Sorry.
Yeah, because I mean, I'm big into relationships. I mean, that's just generally how I feel about the world. I'm not someone who's particularly solitary. And so it's a positive arc because that's a relationship coming together and that relationship rewards him. That is the equivalent of the medal ceremony in Star Wars. Star Wars isn't about the music and the triumph. It's that moment in which the character has done and is needed for them in that. I know Mel is disagreeing.
No, I'm not.
But-
I'm not actually. I just, the term reward, I'm like, well, you're right, but oh my God.
It's a shorthand,
Yeah,
right?
I don't actually disagree.
I'm just excited that there's a potential episode out there where we do All of Us Strangers, Paddington 2, and Predator Badlands. That is a potential homework episode.
I will be stocking up on tissues beforehand.
Okay. Is there anything going into, we don't know what our homework is, but when we finally have our list of our homework, is there anything you're like, you know what, I was going to be thinking about blah, but now I'm thinking about bleh. Like, is there a new lens that you're going to be coming in at when you review this stuff? And then maybe you'll discover a third thing.
I don't actually think there's a new lens for me yet. I'm sure there will be. But you know what I do think is interesting? Going back to my quadrant graph, I think what will be interesting for me is to take whatever we do decide our homework is and to look at where those characters land on those points. How, on two levels. One, are they all grouped together? Are they well apart? Are the ones that emotionally affect me more, grouped together or apart, etc.? And then also looking at where they are on the chart, considering how they're written, and do you start finding different patterns or different, arcs that present in a certain way? And obviously then you apply different lenses as well, right? Like genre, Predator Badlands is obviously going to be able to do something very different than After Sun because of the world that they're operating in. But I think using that chart for me will be quite helpful going, okay, where do these characters lie? How far to any given extreme are they? And then taking that and saying, oh, if I have a character that is in a very similar place on the chart, how is that similar or different?
All right, I'm going to jump in just because it's where my brain grenaded, right? You made the comment about isn't just a character arc an emotional event for the audience, but I'm now like coming back to the Paul Mescal thing. I'm like, yeah, that's reward punishment is about the emotional event. Like in the simply, is the character closer to the world or is it away from the world? And are they close to the audience and they're away from the audience? And I talked about the camera pulling away and making us go, oh, maybe the character's evil. But that is literally just visually distancing us from the character. So I'm going to come into this thinking about the concept of character arcs as an emotional event, as the entire arc is the emotional event. And as we talked about in our emotional event episode, which is the other episode of Draft Zero, if you're going to listen, I mean, if you're this far, you've listened to this one, but if you're going to listen to any others, you should listen to Catharsis, though at some point we should fucking remaster it. It's been like 12 years. And the emotional event. But I think that's it. I actually think beginning to, that's contrast, closer together. Right. It connects it on a relationship level. And we're talking about a character's relationship to themselves. Am I closer to myself? Whatever does that mean? It's usually my sense of who I am. Am I closer or away? And the world ultimately represents the characters that are around. And I think films that are richer, where the characters more individuated and represent, for lack of a better word, different factions, that's more complex. But when you've got, here's the Imperials, here's the Rebels, it's really to say that character is now closer to the Rebels because they're literally getting medals from them, right? And then how does the film metaphorically, visually, or literally position us as closer or farther away, I think can be a really simple binary. I'm going to come into whatever our homework is, and maybe I'll even forgotten it by the time I'm finished those films and got something else. But for now.
Well, I'm going to build on that, where I think my big difference from having done this episode, going into the homework and the lenses that we're going to do, is actually exploring the audience relationship with the character arc. That is something that I don't think I was thinking about coming into tonight. And I'm coming out of tonight going, it's one of the integral parts because it is fundamental to the question of, should I have a character arc or not? because what is the relationship I want that story, that transformation, that journey to have with the audience? Sounds so fucking obvious at the end of...
Hey, it only took us 2 hours to get there.
But you got there, Jazz. You got there.
Thank you. I'm also, I think, going to use the rock, not Dwayne Johnson, but an actual rock.
The literal rock and the stalactite, yep.
A literal rock is a great way of discussing both character change over time and external versus internal forces. I think it is just such a great way of talking about it.
Yeah. Are they a creative force, which I think is a unifying force? Are they a destructive force, which is a force toward? I mean, that's the tensions, right? Are you creating order? Are you creating disorder? Or are you inert?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the rock is a good way of thinking about that. Like, is a rock? You got a rock. Would you say fire is kind of destructive? Would you describe water? I don't describe water as creative.
No, but taking the rock metaphor perhaps too far, a rock can be steadfast in the face of fire and water.
So we got rock, scissors, paper. So rock is rock.
Rock is rock. Scissors are scissors. This is an audio medium.
I'm so glad no one can see that, other than people who might want to see it.
I mean, if people want to read about scissoring, Mel's fan fiction is going to be in the show notes. Thanks.
I actually don't want to challenge you to find it because I'm worried that you would take the challenge.
If nothing else, I hope our listeners to this episode experience what I experience when I both edit these episodes and also when I listen to other screenwriting podcasts, is all it does is fire off neurons in relation to my own work. So hopefully this more esoteric discussion fires off thoughts in relation to your own work.
Hopefully we're more fire or scissors than rock.
I always try to be more scissors than rock.
Never be paper. Never be paper.
Definitely paper bad. Paper bad. Fire, possibly worse.
Thank you, both of you, for coming on and recording and getting through this episode and making it super entertaining for me. So hopefully it's super entertaining for the audience. Thanks as always to our amazing patrons who make More Draft Zero happen more often. In particular, our top tier patrons, Crob, Thies, Sandra, Jesse, Randy, Paolo, Thomas, Jen, Malay, Alexandra, and I feel like we should credit Alexandra's other half. Is it Natalie? God, I'm probably getting her name wrong and just ruining that whole thing. We should say Academy Award-winning Alexandra, as he will forever be known.
And Natalie. It's both of them.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Only one of them is on my fucking Patreon list here. Natalie, you need to take over Alexandra's patronage of our podcast.
I'll fix it with the automatic Patreon extraction that reads the Patreon API to work out who is the patrons at the time of the publishing and inject them into the show notes. And what I'll get it to do is to remap that to say Natalie and Alexandra.
But in Chaz's voice, right?
And we now have, thanks to Stu's relentless Googling of himself, we now know we have a BAFTA award-winning listener as well. So damn you all listeners for being more successful than the hosts of this podcast.
For now.
Forever.
I hope you all feel like arguing with either Stu or myself
about anything on this episode or anything in general.
And you can find many ways of getting in touch with us at our website at draft-zero.com.
At the website, you'll also find the show notes for this and all our other episodes,
as well as links to support us and spread the word for free via a rating and review on Apple Podcasts.
Very important for spreading the word.
Or if you think that what we do here is worth $1 or preferably more than $1, then you can also find links to our Patreon page to support us getting these episodes to you quicker. Thanks.
And thanks for listening.
And now for Back Matter.
Hopefully this drops by 30 June. So hopefully not, given that I know the date of your official Australian.
No, the official
or is that just
date.
the party?
The party is the 4th of July. Happy Independence Day to me.
choice.
Thank you. The actual ceremony is the week prior because it's on a Thursday at 2 p.m., which is a very random time to have a citizenship ceremony, but there you are. And so for everyone's sanity, mostly mine, it is 4th of July instead.
It's what they would call in the men's right or pickup arts community a shit test. They're trying to shit test you, which is like, it's negging. It's like, how much do you really want to be Australian? Because you can be Australian if you come at 3:15 a.m. on Tuesday.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you miss out.
I'm now in the sunk cost fallacy of this relationship where I have poured so much money and paperwork and admin and literal blood and piss and tears. I mean, the tears weren't mandatory. They just kind of happened at the, 18th time that the same amount of paperwork had to be refiled. That there's certainly no way, honestly, I would drag myself there like over shredded glass at this point because they owe me that certificate.
And this has immediately become back matter.
I was going to say, speaking of sunk cost fallacies, because we've been doing drafts for 12 years.